Alright, Techno pilots, let's start with flight controls part 2. If you haven't watched part 1, then obviously go ahead and watch part 1 first because it does not make any sense to watch part 2 if you haven't watched part 1. So, firstly, watch that. I know it's 1 hour 30 minutes something, but please watch it first. And people who have already watched part 1, welcome to flight controls part 2. Let's start with flight controls. So, firstly, we have trailing edge flaps. Why have I mentioned trailing edge here? Because there are two types of flap. One is your trailing edge flaps, and then you have your leading edge flaps. So, firstly, we'll be starting with trailing edge flaps. But, firstly, tell me what do you understand from the term flap, and why do we need them? So, in this particular diagram, you can see that this particular section of the wing, this is known as your flaps, or to be more precise, trailing edge flaps. So, why do we need them? What is it? What purpose is it serving? So the purpose is increased lift generated by the wings at low speeds, which is generally during initial climb out, approach, and landing. All right. So by reading this, you understood that flaps they help to generate some lift. All right. So they are lift making devices. So they generate lift. But their primary purpose is to generate lift at lower speeds, right? And lower speeds are generally at your initial climb out, approach, and landing. So, how does a flap generate lift, and why is it necessary at lower speeds? So, you know what a lift equation is, right? Lift is half rho v square CL dot S. If you didn't know it, now you know it. The lift depends on your half, which is a constant, rho, which is your density, v square is your test, CL depends on your angle of attack, and camber majorly, and there are several other factors on which CL depends on. But for now, we'll just consider angle of attack and camber, right? So there are several other factors on which CL depends on. That's why we have just combined all of them and written it as CL. All right. And then it also depends on your surface area of the wing. All right. So these are all of the factors on which lift depends on, right? So let's take an example of an aircraft just coming in for landing. This is the aircraft is approaching, right? Now, lift is, sorry, your flaps are there for providing extra lift, right? Now, why do you need extra lift? That we are going to discuss. So, now you already know the lift equation, right? So, tell me one thing. If you're the pilot of this aircraft and you have deployed the flaps and you're coming in for landing, and I ask you, why did you deploy flaps? Why do you need them? So you can respond like, see, I'm approaching and I want to approach at a slower speed. You want to reduce your velocity, right? You cannot be just, you know, coming like a roller coaster and landing the aircraft because, firstly, that would be difficult for you to land the aircraft. Secondly, it will also occupy a longer runway length, right? So it is always safer to approach at a lower speed, right? But if you reduce your velocity, if you reduce your velocity, it will reduce your lift, right? Because they are directly proportional to each other, right? If you reduce your task, if you reduce this value, then this will reduce, right? But you don't want that. So when you have deployed flaps, you have got something known as extra lift, right? So see, a pilot who has deployed flaps has increased the angle of attack, has increased the camber, right? So there was already some additional lift that we had. And now, when we were approaching, we have reduced our velocity, which will reduce our lift. But now, since lift was already extra, if it is reduced, it is fine, right? Now we'll have the same lift, but we are coming at a slower velocity. That is exactly what we want, and that is what your flaps do, right? They provide you some extra lift, which you then use to reduce your velocity. Understood? So I have already explained how the camber and angle of attack increase again in the part one, and flaps also do. They also increases your drag, so it becomes easier for you to bleed off this velocity, this extra speed. All right. So this is how your flaps work. So next is types of flaps. So there are variety of types of flaps. So in this image, you can see that there are what, one, two, three, four, five types of flaps that we have to study. Firstly, we have plain flaps. So plain flap, as the name suggests, they are very basic type of flap, and they're used in your light aircraft, and they work by again increasing the camber and the angle of attack of the wing. And one thing you need to remember is that they produce high drag. There's nothing much that you need to keep in your head. Just remember that they are very basic type of flaps which are used in light aircraft, and they work by increasing the camber of the wing to produce high drag. All right. So next type of flap is your split flap. Split flap is something in which the wing remain intact and only the flap surface moves downward. So unlike your plain flap, in plain flap, although like the complete wing surface move downward, but here in split flap you can see that the wing surface is still intact. It has not moved, only the flap surface has moved downward, right? So this is a split flap, and they're not very efficient because they give you a little extra lift as compared to your plain flap, but they also produces a lot of drag. So this is not desirable. So your split flaps, they although gives a little more lift than your plain flaps, but they produce a lot of drag. So these are your split flaps. Then you have slotted flaps. So slotted flaps, they when extended produces a slot which allows high pressure air to move over to the top surface and avoid flow separation. So slotted flaps, when they are extended, in the last image you can see slotted flaps. So when they're extended, they produce a slot. What is a slot? Slot is just a gap. So it is just some empty space that you can see that the flap has created, right? So this is known as a slot. And what is the purpose of a slot? So see, this thing you should know that this is your airfoil, right? And the air will be flowing over the surface like this, right? So what happens? The air loses its energy slowly as the air is coming in and it's traveling this much distance. So what happens? Air loses its energy with time, and then it starts to separate like this. And as the air separates, it becomes what? Turbulent. So this particular air that you are seeing has separated and has become what? Turbulent. This is your turbulent air. That we'll study more about that in POF. But for now, this is all you need to know, that when air is coming in, what happens with the time? It loses energy, and slowly at a point it will start to separate when it has lost all of its energy, right? So you can see that this particular portion of the wing, this much, is having almost no airflow over it, right? Because the air is getting separated from here only. The air is coming in like this, it is coming over the wing, slowly losing its energy and then getting separated here, right? So this particular portion, this end portion that you're seeing, this portion of the wing is having almost no airflow over it. So it is being useless, right? Because in order to generate lift, you need to have a lower pressure at the top and a higher pressure at the bottom, which is generated because of this airflow. If there is no airflow, so this particular portion of the wing is just useless, right? And this is an issue, right? So your slot, how does they work? So see, your slots help to reduce this thing. Now again, you have your high pressure here, see, right, and your low pressure here. So as you can see, there is a slot over here, right? So what will happen? Your air on top of the surface will do its work like normally. It will be moving in like this, coming in through here, losing its energy. But at this particular point, what will happen? The air at the bottom, which is at higher pressure, this particular air which is coming in from the downward section of the wing is at a higher pressure. So this high pressure air will move in through the slot like this, and then it will re-energize this low pressure air which was having a lot of less energy, right? This air which was coming in from here was at a very low energy, and now this high pressure air has come in and has re-energized this air, so it won't separate and it will do its work. It will continue its flow. So as you can see, the high pressure air come in from here, it entered through the slot, and it re-energized the low pressure air over the top of the surface of the wing. So this is how your slot is helpful. So now this portion of the wing is producing lift. So this is how your slotted flaps are very, very helpful because they produce this slot Just a hole or just a gap in the wing helps in re-energizing the air, or else what would happen? It would have separated from here, right? The air would have separated from here. But because of the slot, the air is not getting separated, it is getting re-energized. All right. Remember this term re-energized because they'll be using this term very often in principle of flight. So remember it. And this is how your slotted flaps work. Then you have your Fowler flaps. So Fowler flaps, they can move backward. All of the flaps that we have seen till now, we have seen that they were moving what downwards, downwards. Even this, oh sorry, this is your Fowler. This was also moving downwards, right? So your Fowler flaps have the ability to move backwards, right? So you can see in the diagram, earlier the flaps would be somewhere here, right? And it has moved backwards, right? So the Fowler flaps, they can move backwards, which increases the wing area. Obviously, the wing area would be this big now because they have moved downwards. And they can move downwards, and which increases what your lift without increasing much drag. So whenever a Fowler flaps moves backward, what happens? Your lift increases by a lot, but your drag does not increase much, which is good for your takeoff. So whenever you're thinking about taking off, so it would be best for you to have minimum drag and have higher lift. Why? Obviously. So if you have your aircraft on the runway and it looks like a shoe, but okay. So your aircraft on the runway and you're ready for takeoff and you started your takeoff roll. So when you're taking off, would you want to have a high amount of drag? No, right? Because you are trying to accelerate, and why would you want drag to stop you, right? So you would not want drag, but would you want lift? Obviously, because if you have sufficient lift, then you can rotate early, or else you would have to take a longer takeoff run, right? So you want lift, but you don't want drag. But when you're coming in for landing, let's take an aircraft somewhere here coming in for landing. So this aircraft will want what? He wants more drag and more lift, right? Because velocity is reduced when it's coming in for landing. So he wants, in order to compensate for that, the loss of velocity, he has to apply flaps. So the flaps are there. But he also wants more drag. More drag will be there, so it will be easier to bleed off the extra velocity, right? So for an aircraft coming in to land, more drag is good thing. More drag and more lift, both the aircraft, both he wants when he is coming in for landing. But for a aircraft who is taking off, he wants only what? More lift, not more drag, right? So this is what Fowler flaps fixes. Fowler flaps, they can give you additional lift without increasing drag, and they can also give you additional lift with increasing drag. So whenever they move backward, you get additional lift without increasing drag. So they're ideal for what? Takeoff. Whenever they move backward, good for takeoff, right? And when they are moving downwards, they can also move downwards. Now, if the flaps is deployed downward, lift though already has increased because it has moved downward, sorry, backwards. So the lift has increased. But and now they have moved downward, so it will also increase drag, which is ideal for your landing, right? So they can work in both ways. So this is what your Fowler flaps is. Then you have double slotted Fowler flaps. Nothing much in that. They are just a combination of your slotted flaps. So you have your slotted flaps with a slot and your Fowler flaps. So this is the most modern type of flaps which will be used in your airliners. So you'll have two slots in that. I don't have the image here, but you'll have two slots there. So, like this is your wing. You have one slot over here, another slot over here, and they'll also move backward and they'll also move downward. So this would be what your double slotted Fowler flap. Tail Fowler flaps, just remember that they can move backward and downward. When they move backward, they provide extra lift without increasing much drag. And when they move downwards, they provide extra lift with increasing drag, which is ideal for landing. And only backward is ideal for your takeoff. Now let's start with leading edge devices. So we have seen the trailing edge devices or flaps. So these we have already seen. Now we have to discuss the leading edge device. What are the devices that are installed on the front portion of your wing or the leading edge of the wing? So there are three devices. You have slats, you have Kruger flaps, and you have variable camber flaps. So let's start with leading edge devices. Firstly, leading edge devices can be used in combination. Like you can have flats You can have Kruger flaps, you can have variable camber flap, all of them fitted in one aircraft, or you can have a combination of any two, or you can also have a single one of them on your aircraft. So whenever a combination is used, the Kruger flaps are always fitted near the wing root. So we can see in this particular example, you can see that the Kruger flaps, they are installed at the wing root. Wing root is what, the portion which is closest to your fuselage. This is your wing root. So in this portion, there will be always Kruger flaps, and your slats or variable camber flap might be fitted at your roots or these sections. But remember that the Kruger flaps, they are always fitted closest to the wing root. Right? Even in this example, your Kruger flaps are used with variable camber flaps, but Kruger flaps are again fitted to your wing roots. All right. So remember this thing. And then so you don't have to go in any detail about Kruger flaps or variable camber flaps. So you just need to know that when they extend, they the Kruger flaps, they maintain the flat shape. What is the flat shape? So you can see that in this first figure, this is what your Kruger flap is. So you can see that there is a flat portion over here. This particular portion is flat, right? And even in your variable camber flap, you can see that this portion is flat. But watch what happens to these flat portion when they extend. So in Kruger flap, what will happen when it extends? The flat surface will be still flat. But in a variable camber flap, you can see when it will extend, the front portion will curve. So now it is appearing to be flat in both of the diagrams, but when they will extend, they'll curve. So you'll see a clip now, and you'll have a better understanding what I'm saying. So as you can see, the flaps extending, and still this surface is what, flat, right? But now watch this. As you can see, it has curved, and as you can see, this thing has curved. Like this is curved, right? This one was straight. Now what happens when it retracts? See, the curvature is gone and it has become flat again. So this is all you need to know about Kruger flaps now, and about your variable camber flap. All right. Then we have slats. So slats, they slide forward and downwards, which creates a slot and re-energizes the airflow on top of the wing edge delays stall. So as we already saw in flaps, that there was a type of flap known as Kruger flap, which was creating a slot. There was a slot and it was re-energizing the flow. This is exactly what we do, but in terms of flap, we have attached it at the rear portion of the wing. But in terms of your flats, we have attached something here. So they also do the exact same thing. They also re-energizes the flow by creating a slot. Again, you can see that in this diagram, and in this diagram, you can see the difference that the air is very turbulent over the top of the wing. Why is it turbulent? Obviously, because there is no slot. So see, the air is coming in like this. It is getting over the surface, and with time, as I told you, that it will lose energy. So it lost its energy and it is becoming turbulent. So this portion of the wing is now useless. It is not producing lift. The aircraft might come to a stall, right? Now, in the second diagram, you can see that there is a slat which is extended and has created what? A slot. So this gap that you're seeing is what? Your slot. So what the slot has done is when your airflow is like this, coming in from the top portion, it will go. And with time, it was losing energy, right? It was losing energy. But the high pressure air from the bottom surface came in and it moved through the slot. There is high pressure at the bottom, right? So it moved through the slot and it strike this particular portion. It hit the low pressure air and it re-energizes the low pressure air. So now the wing will not stall. So your slats produces slots. Slots help in re-energizing the airflow at the top of the wing, as exactly as similar as our hollow flaps. Air is coming in like this. The air was going like this. It was losing energy, about to separate. But the air at the bottom with the high pressure, obviously there is high pressure at the bottom surface, there is low pressure on top of the surface. So the high pressure air came in and moved through this slot, and it joined the low pressure air and re-energized it. Right. This is how your leading edge device or your slat is working. All right, so next we have is trimming. So trimming allows pilot to hold the control surface in a specific position without the pilot needing to apply manual inputs. So you know how do we climb or descend the aircraft, right? So in order to climb, the pilot pulls in on the yoke, right? The pilot will move it towards him, right? And what it does when the pilot pulls the yoke towards it, the aircraft starts to climb. Why? And what is happening at the back portion of the aircraft? The Your elevator surface is deflecting upwards like this, right? So this is your elevator and it is deflecting upwards. But uh, these this pilot needs to constantly keep pulling on this yoke in order for the aircraft to climb, right? Because they are connected with pulleys and cables to this particular elevator, and there is constantly airflow hitting this particular portion. If the pilot leaves his control, the aircraft won't climb, right? So the pilot constantly have to hold this control column in order to climb, right? So this will make this pilot very sad and fatigued, right? So, how do we avoid it? So, there is something known as a trimming tab or concept of trimming. So, trimming helps to reduce the pilot's effort and it makes the pilot happy, right? So, it helps the pilot so that the pilot will not have to apply any forces. And we'll see how this works. So, there are different methods for trimming. Firstly, we have trimming tabs, then we have variable incident tail plane, then we have the spring bias trimming, center of gravity adjustment. We'll go through one by one. All right, so let's start with trimming tabs. So, what are trimming tabs? Trimming tabs are small adjustable surface which are fitted in the trailing edge of the main control surface. So, if you can see this diagram, this is your control surface. This can be your elevator, aileron, or rudder. And this portion that you're seeing here is what your trimming tab. All right. So the trimming tabs, they are attached at the rear portion of your main flying control. All right. How do they work? So they work in a very similar manner to a balance tab. If you remember from the last lecture, balance tab is a tab which moves in opposite direction to your flight controls, and it was assisting the pilots, right, to reduce the control column forces or the stick forces. So uh, the trimming tab works in an exact same manner. And how does it work? So this is the control surface, right? So the control surface will be generating a force from the last lecture again. Since it is deflected downwards, it will be generating a force upwards, right? So this would be the force generated by the control column. All right, so let's call it what? F1, right? And the trimming tab is deflected upwards. So it will generate a force downwards. And this would be what? F2. One more thing from the last lecture, if you remember, that your F2 will be smaller than F1. Why is that? It is because the forces depends on the size of the controls. So in this case, the size of your tab is smaller than the size of your control surface. That is why the force generated by the control surface will be larger and the force generated by the trimming tab will be smaller. Alright. So this is the difference between the forces. So the tabs, they work by balancing the moments. So the moment is what? Again, moment is force multiplied by distance, right? Again, from the last lecture. So moment is force multiplied by distance, and the trimming tab, they work by balancing the moments. So what are these moments and how is it balancing them? So if you can see, there are two different forces, F1 and F2. So there will be two different moments. All right, so let's take moment number one. Moment number one would be what? Force number one multiplied by the distance. So what is the distance? Distance is always taken from the hinge. So this is the hinge. So from here to the center of pressure, there is a point from which the force is acting. So let's call it D1. So what would the moment one would be F1 multiplied by D1. Now there will be a second moment. Let's take it M2. So moment 2 would be what? F2 multiplied by, let's take our distance 2 as again from the hinge. Let's extend this. So from the hinge here to the point where the force is acting. So this would be what? Your D2. Let's take this distance as d2. So you have two moments, moment number one and moment number two. Now, these moments can balance each other because although the F1 is larger and F2 is smaller, but the T1 is smaller and D2 is larger, right? So they are balancing each other. So M1 might be equal to your M2, right? So this is what is called as a trimmed condition because the force one or the moment that we are creating here would balance out the moment that is being created by your trimming tab, right? So by balancing these movements, the pilot can now release his or her hands from the control, and the control will still be in this position because the moments are in balance, right? So this is how a trimming tab works. It balances the moments. It balances the moment number one by creating a second moment, which is through the trimming tab, right? So this is how the trimming tab is working, right? And there is a trimming wheel in the aircraft. So this second image that you're seeing is a black colored wheel, mostly in black color. This is your trimming wheel. So unlike balance tab, your uh, trimming tab is directly controlled by the pilot with the help of a trimming wheel. So the trimming wheel will be directly connected to your trim tab, and the pilot can move this tab up and down, and this will directly move your trimming tab so that you can adjust and you can find out a perfect movement which will balance out your elevator's movement or your control surface movement, right? And the control effectiveness is reduced again. As you can recall from the last lecture, there is a force which is generated in the opposite direction. So this is the F1 that we were creating, right? This is something that we wanted, but because of the deflection of the trim tab, there is a second force F2 in the opposite direction, right? So the control effectiveness is reduced. And there is one more point in some light aircraft, there might be a fixed permanent trim tab. So, what is a fixed permanent trim tab or a ground adjustable trim tab? So in the third diagram, you can see that there is a tab, a red color tab in this case, which is fitted on the rudder and it is screwed, right? So, it is screwed and it is fixed permanently there, so it cannot be controlled with the pilots. The pilots cannot move this tab with the help of any controls in the cockpit, right? So why is it there? Because there are some aircrafts in which there is a permanent out of control condition. For example, I have an aircraft and with time or because of some defects or some damages, what happened is my aircraft is constantly yawing to the right hand side, right? So whenever I take off, I do not put anything, the aircraft constantly is going yawing to the right. Even in our cars, it happens sometimes. The alignment is not correct, right? So in aircraft, instead of hefty repairs, what they do is they just install a permanent tab, right? So this tab cannot be moved, but because of this tab, the aircraft can be fixed. Now the aircraft will be going straight, right? So these tabs have this only purpose that they can fix any permanent out of control conditions, right? And they're very basic. And yeah, you cannot control them from the cockpit. They are only be changed or moved, or they can be adjusted only on the ground. That's why they are also called as ground adjustable rudder trim, right? Ground adjustable trim, right? It can, if it's fitted on rudder, then it will be a rudder trim, right? Then there is the second type of trim, variable incidence tailplane. So what is the variable incidence tailplane? Again, from the last lecture, if you remember, the whole tailplane moved, right? The whole tailpin moved up and down instead of there being an elevator, the whole tailpin was moving, right? So this is what a variable incident tailpin is. Now, that same variable incident tailpin can be used as a trim. So this is known as a variable incident tailplane, right? So the angle of incidence of the tailplane is changed using trim switches. What are these trim switches? These are the trim switches on your control column. So there are these switches which you can press up and down, right? So these switches move this variable incident tailplane up and down, and it changes the trim of the aircraft, right? And they change angle of incidence. Obviously, this again we have studied in depth in the part one, and it does not produce as much drag as in the trim tab. So the trim tab that we were using, like the control surface, and then there was a tab. So this thing produces a lot of drag. If I deflect it downwards, then it will come into airflow a lot and it will produce a lot of drag. But in case of variable incidence tail, then there is just a single, you know, single tail plane which is moving. So it produces significantly less drag as compared to your trim tab, right? And trim for larger changes since control effectiveness is not affected. Again, there is no control effectiveness being affected because there is a single force which is generated upwards, obviously, or if the tail is moved downwards, then it will be generated downward. But the thing is that the control effectiveness is not affected because there is no force which is acting in opposite direction, unlike in our trim tab, right? So this is your variable incidence tail plane trimming method. Then there is a spring bias trimming. So this method is completely confined into your cockpit. There is no attachments on your control surface or on your what do you call it? Your all moving tail or your stabilizer. There's nothing there. It is all confined to the cockpit. So how does it work? So you can see in the image number one that there are springs which are attached to your rudder pedals. So these are your rudder pedals, right? And this that you're seeing is your fin or this is your rudder, right? So what is happening is as the pilot presses with his feet, the pilot presses with his feet on the rudder, he pushes the rudder like this, right? And then after pressing it, pilot does it what? Pilot rotates this trim control. So there is a trim control over here, this that you're seeing. This is a trim control. So the pilot can rotate it and this changes your springs. So it adjusts your spring. So the trim control is directly connected to your springs, right? Now as the pilot rotates this trim, the springs, one spring will be what pulling, this spring will be pulling, and this spring will be pushing. So even if the pilot removes his feet now, the rudder pedals will still be in that exact position, right? So the rudder surface will be deflected, right? But the pilot is having to apply no force now because the pilot has moved or rotated the trim control. It is a very, very basic method. It's not at all complicated. There are just two springs, which are one is pulling and another one is pushing, depending on which rudder the pilot is pressing, right? And even if the pilot removes the forces, then also it is holding the rudder, right? So this is your spring bias trimming. Then there is something known as a Mach trim. Mach trim is a completely different thing. So what happens? There is a phenomena known as a Mach tuck. So what is a Mach tuck? So at higher speeds, if you are approaching high subsonic speeds, if your aircraft is flying at high subsonic speeds, then what happens? Your center of pressure, you know what a center of pressure is, the point where the whole lift is acting. So this center of pressure, the CP, tends to move rearward, producing a large nose down pitching movement, which is known as Mach tuck. Right. So in this diagram, you can see that this is your center of gravity, right? So this is the point from where the whole weight of the aircraft is acting, right? The whole weight is acting from this particular point. It is pulling the aircraft down from here. This is what you can imagine, right? And the center of pressure is a point from which the whole lift is acting. So this is pulling upwards. The whole lift of the aircraft is pulling upwards, right? So at higher speeds, the center of pressure, like earlier, let's say it was somewhere here. Now the center of pressure has moved backwards and the center of pressure is now here, right? So what this has caused a moment like this, right? Obviously, because center of gravity, the point from where the whole aircraft is being pushed downwards, is already here, and the center of pressure is moved backward. If it moves further backward, let's say here, then there will be even larger pitch down movement, right? So this is known as a phenomena Mach tuck, and this happens at high subsonic speeds. All right. So the phenomena of CP moving rearward as the aircraft approaches high subsonic speed is known as Mach tuck, and there has to be a system which corrects this, right? So the system which corrects this is known as a Mach trim system. right? So the Mach trim system is fitted, which corrects this Mach tuck, and this Mach trim system activates at high subsonic speed regardless if the autopilot is engaged. It does not matter if the autopilot is engaged or no. The Mach trim system will automatically kick in and correct this deadly nose down pitching movement of the aircraft. Right. So this is known as a Mach trim. Then we have the center of gravity adjustment. So this is another method for trimming. So center of gravity adjustment is done because see, your stabulator or your all moving tail is although very effective, right? So as compared to your trim tabs, your stabulator or all moving tail is very effective, right? Because it does not produce additional drag, first of all, and it does not decrease your control effectiveness, right? So your all moving tail is a lot better than your what do you call it, your trimming tabs, right? But you can um, reduce this drag further. So all moving tail is although very effective, but you can further reduce this drag by moving the stabulator to neutral position. So this is the image one. You can see there is the stabulator has moved upwards, right? But in the image two, you can see that the stabulator is in a straight position. So which will be more aerodynamic efficient? Obviously, number two, there will be lesser winds. It is more aerodynamic efficient, right? So how can we move the stabulator in neutral position? The answer to that is by moving the center of pressure and center of gravity close to each other. So if you have center of pressure and center of gravity over here, the stabulator can be straightened out. How? So obvious, you can see in the first diagram, the center of gravity is here. This thing is again pulling the aircraft downward. This is the point where the whole weight of the aircraft is acting, and the center of pressure is here. So it is pulling the aircraft. The whole lift of the aircraft is acting here. There will be a net pitch down movement again, right? So because of this pitch down movement, the aircraft will tend to pitch down, right? But to correct this, the tail plane has to apply a down force. The tail plane is deflected upward so that it can apply a force downward, right? And this downward force is lifting the aircraft upwards now. So the aircraft is flying straight and level, right? So this has to be done because the center of pressure and the center of gravity is having this distance between them, which is creating this movement, right? And because of this movement, the tailpin has to be in this position, right? But we can correct this by keeping the center of pressure and center of gravity on top of each other or very close to each other. This will have almost zero movement because they are obviously over each other. So there is no movement. There is no pitch down movement. The aircraft will fly level, and this thing can be moved in your neutral position, right? So this will be more aerodynamic efficient. All right, so what are spoilers and speed brakes? So spoilers, their purpose is to reduce the lift of the wing. So if you remember, we had already done spoilers. So spoilers are these surfaces that just pops out or stands up on the wing. So they disturb the airflow of the wing, and this cause what? Reduction or spoiling the lift of the wing, right? So this is the purpose of the spoilers. They reduce the lift, of the wing, right? Remember the term lift, right? And what are speed brakes then? Speed brakes, their purpose is to increase the drag. Speed brakes increase drag, and spoilers, they reduce lift. So in the first image, you can see this aircraft is having something known as speed brakes. So if you watch closely, so these are known as air brakes or speed brakes. So their purpose is what? To increase the drag, which will slow down the aircraft, right? But most of the modern airliners, they only have spoilers. Why? Because since a reduction in the lift means increasing the angle of attack to maintain the level flight, which eventually increases drag, right? So you might have understood this sentence. If you didn't, then see. Lift is what? Lift is rho v square cl dot s, right? Now, if you reduce your lift because you deployed spoilers, let's say this aircraft as example. So if you deployed your spoilers, then your lift reduce, right? Now, since your lift has reduced, your aircraft will tend to go downwards because the weight is more than the lift now. Lift has reduced, the weight is more. The aircraft will go down. Now you want to maintain a level flight. right? You don't want to go down. So what will you do? You'll increase any of these elements in your left equation. So what will you do? You'll increase your angle of attack. Now you'll ask me where is angle of attack. So you should know where it is. So it is in the CL, right? CL depends on your angle of attack and your camber, right? So the angle of attack when increased increases your lift, right? So you'll do is what? You'll pitch the aircraft upwards, which will increase your angle of attack, right? And angle of attack increases, which means your lift will be now more. So the aircraft will come back to the balance strike, right? So spoilers deployed, lift reduces. Now you increase your angle of attack to maintain the lift, right? So this caused what? Increase in angle of attack, and then as more angle of attack is there, the aircraft will experience a higher drag. Obviously, more angle of attack means more air will be hitting the aircraft surface. There will be more parasite drag, right? So this means there will be more drag, right? So just because we deployed spoilers, we had a reduction in the lift, and to compensate for the reduction, we increased the angle of attack. As the angle of attack increased, the drag increased, right? So that's why we don't need speed brakes in our aircraft. The spoilers can function as both speed brakes and your spoilers, of course, right? Then the effectiveness of braking depends upon the weight on the wheels, right? So spoilers help to spoil the left of the wing, creating more weight on the wheels, which helps in effective braking, right? So your brakes, the effectiveness of your brakes depends upon how much weight is there on the brakes, right? So there is lift on the aircraft's wing, right? Because of this lift, the weight on the wheels is reduced, right? And if you spoil this lift, if you deploy spoilers on this thing, the lift will be spoiled, right? And which will cause what? More weight on the wheel, right? So more weight on the wheels means that the braking efficiency of your aircraft will increase. The braking efficiency of your wheels will increase, right? So this is also a purpose of spoilers, and this is asked very often, very often in your exams. So keep this in your head. Then an aircraft has two sets of spoilers. So they are what? Ground spoilers and flight spoilers. They are very self-explanatory. So ground spoilers are operated on the ground always, and they work symmetrically, right? So on the ground, for braking purposes, we use what? For ground spoilers, right? And they always operate symmetrically, right? Why would you want one spoiler on the wing and no spoiler on the other wing? It will be in air, not on ground, right? If you remember, then spoilers can be used as primary flight controls to roll the aircraft, right? So this is exactly what flight spoilers are for. So flight spoilers, they are operated both in flight and on ground. So they can be operated in flight and on ground, and they can also be operated asymmetrically, right? So they can be operated asymmetrically to roll the aircraft to either direction. Again, this is in the part one, if you remember. So there are these two types, ground spoilers and flight spoilers. After landing, if pilots move the thrust lever, then the aircraft will automatically retract the spoilers, signaling a go around, right? So after landing, this is the protection system in the aircraft. If the aircraft is coming in for landing, and as the aircraft touches down, then only the spoilers will be deployed. So as the aircraft touch down, the spoilers will then be deployed, right? But for any reason, if after touchdown the thrust lever will be at idle position, right? Obviously, after touchdown the thrust will be at idle, no? So if for any reason pilot moves the thrust lever a little forward, this will cause what? Your spoilers to retract automatically. All of the spoilers on the wing will retract, and the aircraft will think that the pilot wants to do a go around, right? So that is why all the spoilers just retract themselves, just in case that the pilot think that a go around would be the best option, right? After landing, if the pilot moves the thrust lever forward, automatically the spoilers will retract, signaling a go around, right? Then we have your manual flight controls. So what are manual flight controls? The manual flight controls are the ones in which the pilot controls the flight controls directly with the help of pulleys and cables, right? The control surface are directly connected to the cockpit controls with the help of cables and rod. They are usually known, they are also known as what? A reversible flight control. This is again very important. What are reversible flight controls? So they are your manual flight controls themselves. Why are they known as reversible flight controls? Because if the pilot leaves the control, then the control surface will move back to its neutral position automatically. See, so this is my pilot holding the control column. And for example, the pilot is pulling the control column towards him. So the control column is pulled towards him, which will cause what? The aircraft nose to go up and the elevator surface will also move upwards, right? Now, if the pilot gets tired and he decides to leave the yoke, now the yoke comes back to neutral position. Why? Because the airflow that is hitting this control surface is so powerful that it will deflect the control surface back to its neutral position if the pilot decides to leave the controls, right? So, this is what a reversible flight control is. As the pilot leaves the control comes back to its original position. This is known as a reversible flight control, right? So, these are your manual flight controls. And even in this diagram, you can see that this is a pilot's arm, which is connected to a push-pull rod. And this push-pull rod is connected to a lever arm, which is connected with cables to some pulleys. Pulleys are there to change the direction of the cables, right? So whenever there is a change in direction of the cable, there are pulleys used, right? And then again, there is a lever arm here, and there is a push-pull rod again here, and it is connected to your elevator surface. This is your wing, the tail fin, right? Then what are the components? This is again something very important for your exam. So watch this part carefully. What are the components? So in the manual flight controls, we have these three components, which are mechanical stops, leads, and turnbuckles. All right. So we'll go through them one by one. It is quick and not very lengthy. So let's start. What are mechanical stops? So mechanical stops, they limit the control surface deflection. So if you can see these little black colored uh, obstacle or stops that you're seeing, these are what? These are your mechanical stops. They limit how much your control surface deflect, right? So and there has to be a limit, right? How much control surface can deflect upwards and downward. So this limit is set by your mechanical stops, and we have two sets of mechanical stops. So there are primary sets and secondary sets. So primary stops, they limit the movement of control surface, so they will be fitted here, right? And they limit the movement of this control surface, right, up and down. And there is a secondary stop which limits the movement of your control column or rudder pedals. They'll be fitted here, which will limit the movement of your control column or your rudder pedals. Alright, so these are your mechanical stops, and again, important. Then you have fair leads. So fair leads are something which leads the cable from the cockpit controls to the control surface so that it does not come in contact with other AFM structures. So this portion that you're seeing, these pipelines kind of thing, these are your fair leads. So they have a very, very basic purpose that they carry the cable inside them so that the cable does not go here and there and get tangled in some AFM structures, right? So they lead the cable from your cockpit to your control surface, right? So they are known as what? Fair leads. Then you have turnbuckles. So turnbuckle are there to maintain the tension in the cable. So tension, again, from our lecture one, you know what tension is, right? So they maintain the tension in the cable, right? And why is it so important to maintain the tension? Because if the tension is too high, then the controls will be very stiff. It will be very hard to move the control column, right? If the tension is too high, and if the tension is too low, then the control will have a lag, right? So I will see what a lag looks like. But for example, your cable is very very loose, right? And it is connected to your control surface. So what will happen is if you like maybe pull the cable to pull the control surface towards you, firstly the cable will stretch, right, and then the control surface will move. So there will be a lag, right? Obviously. So this is an issue if you have too low tension, and if you have too high, then it will be very stiff, right? To maintain the tension, we use something known as a turnbuckle. How does a turnbuckle work? So turnbuckle is a very very basic thing. Again, it is not at all complicated. So you can see this portion. This is from where your cable is coming in, right? And these are your screw threads. So they are like a screw, right? And the same thing you have here, you have another screw thread which is connected to your cable, right? What is happening? You have a barrel in the center which you can roll, right? If you roll this barrel, then these screws will get tighten, right? The screws will get tight and it will pull the cable with it, right? In the second diagram, you can see that the thread has moved inwards and because the barrel was rotated and which has moved the thread inward and hence increased the tension in the cables, right? So this is how a turnbuckle is used. And there is something known as an inspection hole in the turnbuckle. So inspection hole have a very simple purpose. They should be fully covered, which shows that the sufficient thread is screwed, right? So there has to be some limit, right? Limit of thread which has to be inserted in the barrel roll. If not, then it might not be able to hold the tension of your cables, right? The cables might snap. So this inspection hole should be covered with thread. So there should be enough screw movement which will move inwards and cover this inspection hole. So the screw should be at least this much in so that it covers the inspection hole and your inspection hole is fully covered so that your cable will not just snap out of this barrel roll, right? So that is why there is an inspection hole in there. And what is a backlash? So backlash is ineffective or free movement of the control column, right? So this is what backlash looks like, right? This is your yoke or your control column, right? So if you push or pull on this, then what will happen? There is very very loose cable here, right? So there will be a lot of lag, and if the control column is moved, so the control column needs to be moved considerable distance before the flight controls show any movement, right? You'll have to move this a lot, a lot, a lot, and then the flight control will start to move a little bit, right? So this is why this is known as what backlash, right? And this can also cause flutter, right? Backlash can lead to flutter. All right, so that is it for the flight controls. We're done with flight controls. There is nothing else left. We're almost done with system. There might be like two more videos coming in, and then the system will be completed. And before those two videos, there will be something else coming up. I'm trying to cook something for you, and you might like it. Let's see. But this is all for flight controls. Bye bye. Enjoy.